thanks, Professor Horowitz, for inviting me. I think this is so cool that St. Francis has this whole lecture series on problems in urban policing. I wish I'd had something like this in college. So I do have a question. I understand it's a combination of seniors from the community and students. So this first question is directed primarily to the students. How many of you have studied the Fourth Amendment? Okay, so a few of you, good. So the reason I ask is, to a certain extent, this is a Fourth Amendment piece. So for everybody else, the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution governs searches and seizures. So basically, any government interaction where the government stops somebody or arrests somebody or questions somebody, or any government search involves the Fourth Amendment and is governed by the Fourth Amendment. By the way, the students who've studied the Fourth Amendment, can any of you quote it? I guess. You can quote it? Please do.
Amendment. Protection from unreasonable search and seizure. Is that what you want?
No. But good. But what's interesting, what's your name? Thomas. What's interesting, the Fourth Amendment is actually not much longer than what Thomas just said. I mean, the Fourth Amendment is literally 54 words. There's not much there. And to think that that governs so much of our interactions with the government is pretty frightening. So you have heard that the piece I'm going to talk about is called Techno-Policing, which has nothing to do with DJs, although now I have to capitalize on that connection. But it's a piece about how we can use technology and policing in ways that benefit all of us. So before I get into it, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the genesis, or rather a caveat. So I am not a technology person by any stretch of the imagination. I don't have a Facebook page. I don't tweet. I tried Instagram for a day and then closed the account. I definitely do not own my own drone or anything like that. But I do have an iPhone, as I'm sure probably most of the people in this room have. And it was actually my iPhone that got me thinking about the ways we could use technology to sort of enhance Fourth Amendment protections. So the argument I'm going to make in the next 15, 20 minutes or so is it's relatively straightforward. So it's pretty commonplace among Fourth Amendment scholars and privacy scholars to complain about the government encroaching upon our sense of privacy, our sense of anonymity, our right to be left alone. So I don't know if you guys know this, but there are literally surveillance cameras everywhere, for example, in New York. The government can monitor our web browsing activity. It doesn't even implicate the Fourth Amendment for a particular reason. Governments and police are experimenting with drones and Google Glass and all this good stuff. And according to a lot of scholars, you know, we are becoming a surveillance state, or have already become one. Big Brother is watching, and we should be very afraid. So the point I want to make is that, you know, the use of technology does not have to be dystopian. There are ways that we could harness technology to benefit us. And I think a lot of people in this room already know that, because one of the biggest arguments in the last year at least, you know, coming into the public conversation has been requiring police officers to wear body cams. So really my argument is sort of that's really only the beginning. There's so many other ways that we can use technology, or insist that the government use technology, that actually enhance protections for everybody. So some of this might be simple technology, going back to my iPhone. Other more complicated, so at the end of the conversation I'll be talking about terahertz scanners and big data and automated suspicion algorithms. But all of these things I think are things that we can sort of insist on to benefit all of us. So my argument is going to begin, it's sort of structured in three parts. It's sort of going to begin with talking about the Fourth Amendment's requirement for warrants. So for those of you who've studied the Fourth Amendment, you probably know that one of the basic ideas behind the Fourth Amendment is that the police normally need a warrant before they can arrest somebody or before they can search somebody. And we have sort of limited that requirement, but I'm going to argue that technology should put that requirement back in place. So the first part of the argument is going to focus on the warrant requirement and sort of like reviving the warrant requirement. Second part is going to focus on another goal I think we should all have when it comes to policing and the Fourth Amendment, and that's transparency. So transparency is, you could think again about body cams. You know, the reason we want body cameras is so there's transparency about what actually happened. But I think body cams are, again, just the start. One thing I talk about in my paper is the use of more cameras, so more public surveillance cameras. But my main focus for this talk is going to be transparency in another area, and that's going to be consent searches. Third part of my argument, I'm going to focus on, I think, another goal we should have when it comes to policing and the Fourth Amendment, and that's accuracy. And for that, I'm going to focus on how the role technology can play when we talk about stop and frisk and sort of addressing the problem we are all familiar with when it comes to stop and frisk. And for that, I'll be turning to some of the more complicated technologies. And lastly, if I have time, I'm going to make an entirely different argument for why we should be interested in technology and policing. And that last argument is going to be that technology can redistribute privacy in a way that's better for all of us. Privacy is not distributed equally. It never has been. Technology can begin the process of redistributing it in a way that's more egalitarian. So first, warrants. So the Fourth Amendment basically says that warrants are sort of the preferred method that police should obtain evidence. So before a police officer can go into your apartment and search your apartment, they're supposed to go to a magistrate, get a warrant. But if Professor Horowitz doesn't mind, I'm going to be a little bit interactive and ask you questions. Why do you think it's a good thing to have a requirement that police should get warrants? Should we just abandon the warrant? Yes. Yes.
I feel like if they did have warrants, they would just go in and search every time there was like a little crime.
Yeah, they might go in, they might abuse, take advantage of the system. And by the way, just to add to the Fourth Amendment for those of you who haven't studied it, the Fourth Amendment does require that there be probable cause. But we can imagine a system where officers have to have probable cause. They have to be able to articulate, yes, we think there is something in Thomas's apartment and this is the evidence, and yet not separately be required to go to a third-party magistrate to sign off on that. Why? Other reasons why we might want to have a warrant requirement. So you guys are fine if we abandoned it? Thomas?
Not me. Well, I think that police need warrant to show that they actually have permission to search your belongings and to show exactly what they're searching for.
Yeah, to show what they're searching for, so it's limited, it's directed. They can't sort of say like, they can't think like, oh, well, we think Thomas has, somebody tied up in the closet. And meanwhile, while they're there, they're like, oh, let's look on his computer as well. So to limit them, and also to make sure. Any other reasons? Yes.
A written validation that both parties know like what is being searched for, so like people aren't like in the dark about what's going on.
And it might also give you peace of mind. I think that's sort of what you're saying. Instead of the police just showing up at your door saying, we have the right to search, at least sort of seeing a sheet of paper saying some third-party, neutral, objective judge has signed off on this. It's like, okay, peace of mind. Any other reasons? Yes, sir.
It could be used as a tool for harassment. A particular group of people or a person,
If they did not have the warrant requirement. Absolutely. So they might search first, find evidence later, and then sort of say that, use that to justify why they went in the first place. So these are all good reasons. I was going to quote from a case from 1948, a Supreme Court case called Johnson, where the Supreme Court sort of articulated all these reasons. Some of the ones you mentioned, some more, but you really get the picture. I mean, it's not so much that we don't trust officers, but sometimes it's nice to have like a third party, objective, neutral judge to weigh in. Some other reasons, I think, and maybe this came up, just forcing an officer to rationalize why he or she thinks they have probable cause might already sort of self-police that officer. It's one thing to sort of say like, oh, I know I can go in that person's apartment, this is what I think. But being able to articulate it, to write it down and explain it to somebody else might get the officer to realize maybe she does not have enough. Or hindsight bias. We've already talked about deterring abuses, and we've already talked about assuring the suspect. Those are all good reasons. But oddly enough, even though the Fourth Amendment sort of requires a warrant, we've had numerous exceptions, so many exceptions to the warrant requirement that even Justice Scalia has complained that basically the exceptions have swallowed the rule. And I'm going to focus on one exception where I think technology can sort of reverse things. So one of the most well-known exceptions to the warrant requirement is the automobile exception. Anybody know what that is? It's not hot pursuit, but that's sort of, that's actually another area where I think technology can do a great job. Officers can actually go through your car and anybody's car in this room, regardless of whose property it's on, as long as the officer has probable cause to believe there's contraband in the car. What's interesting is the officer, it's one of the exceptions where we say an officer does not first have to go to a magistrate. The case law from the Supreme Court is so long as it's a vehicle that's capable of being moved, then we are going to excuse the warrant requirement. And yes?
Are you not allowed to go through the trunk though?
No, you can go through the trunk. You can. That's actually, you're thinking of another exception. We have so many exceptions. But yes, you can go through the trunk. So this all dates back to a case from 1925 called Carroll v. United States. And I think the facts of the case matter, and they'll explain a little something about the automobile exception. 1925, police officers are in Michigan near the sort of Canada border. They see a vehicle and they recognize the guys in the vehicle. They know the guys are bootleggers. They've encountered them before. And they're thinking, those guys are probably up to their bootlegging again because, we had prohibition. Alcohol was illegal. So they pull the car over, they search it, and they find 68 bottles of whiskey. Again, illegal, criminal offense. They get prosecuted. The only issue is they did not have a warrant. The courts agreed the officers had enough probable cause, but they did not go to a magistrate to get a warrant. But what do? The Supreme Court in 1925 basically created the automobile exception. And they said, cars are different. Because a car can quickly be moved from one jurisdiction to the next, we are going to excuse the warrant requirement for automobiles. That exception still applies today. And in a way, we might be fine with it, but in a way, it's much more general today. It's much more in widespread use. So, and a couple of cases do this. How many of you, by the way, don't be shy, how many of you have been stopped by the police while you're in a car? Okay, for traffic violations? Yes. So for those of you who are stopped for traffic violations, did the officers ask if they could search the car? No? What? They asked for your license, but they could also ask to search the car. So a couple of cases, Wren v. United States from 1996 basically allows pretext stops. So if an officer wants to stop somebody looking for contraband, they could basically wait till you commit a traffic infraction, pull you over, and then hope that somehow once they pull you over, they'll find evidence of contraband, and then once they have that evidence, they could search the car. Or we've added to U.S. v. Wren with a case called Michigan v. Sitz, which allows checkpoint stops. So lots of you probably been stopped in checkpoints. You're thinking fine, but then combine that with a case like U.S. v. Place, which says that when an officer brings a dog to sniff around your car, that is not a search within the meaning of the Fourth Amendment. They don't need anything. So all these things basically says, if an officer happens to pull you over for a traffic stop, but they're really looking for drugs, and they see literally a roach, and for the older people in the room, I think you know what that is. They see a roach in the ashtray, or they smell the remnants of marijuana. Guess what that means? That now means under the automobile exception, they can search the entire car, including the trunk. Even though most of us would say that's a minor offense, and I'm sure some in the room would even say it should be legalized, but that doesn't matter. They now have probable cause. Yes, sir?
Would there be an exception for, like, let's say Colorado, Washington State?
So that's actually one of the interesting issues cropping up right now. So probably in a state where it's been completely legalized, like Colorado, maybe. Except technically, I mean, it's still a federal crime. And it gets more complicated in areas that have permitted exceptions for medical use. Because that's just like, oh, like, you know, is it medical use or not medical use? And I think in those places it would still be enough for probable cause, because probable cause doesn't mean the officer has to be 100% right. It just means that 50-50, at least 50-50, not even at least 50-50, but around 50-50. So all of these things sort of say like, oh, officers can search. We may not be troubled by this, but my only point with technology is a lot of these exceptions might have made sense in 1925, when cars could quickly leave, and believe it or not, people did not have cell phones. But they make less sense today when officers have phones. Like 100% of officers in the field have access to some kind of computer in their vehicle. You can quickly call up a magistrate and get a warrant literally within minutes. So why don't we do that? So the first sort of exception, or the first sort of issue I'm dealing with, is let's revive the warrant requirement. And one way to do that is by sort of retiring the automobile exception. The other way of thinking about this is when the Supreme Court created this automobile exception in 1925, they were responding to a new technology. The car for them was a new technology. Now we have new technology that makes that old technology old and sort of makes the exception they created, I think, outdated. It's interesting because a lot of the technology I'm talking about, I recognize won't address sort of everyday sort of just behavior it won't address a lot of the behavior that's just sort of discourtesy, inappropriate, but it'll address some. So at least with that kind of incident, it actually leads into my next point about transparency. So another goal is transparency. I've already mentioned, as you know, everybody talks about body cams. I think body cams are great, but they do provide a very limited perspective. It's the officer perspective. So one thing I talk about in my article is we don't just want body cams, we want other things as well. So I mentioned, you know, we might all sort of benefit from the fact that there are surveillance cameras everywhere when it comes to police-citizen interactions. So even if we think about the recent video of Officer Frascatore, I think, interacting with James Blake, the tennis player, if we had just seen a body cam perspective from the officer, it would literally be the officer's point of view. It might not look that bad, but actually seeing it from a surveillance camera, in this case it was a hotel, but we could imagine the same thing with the public surveillance, you get a different perspective. And I think having the more perspectives, the better. So that adds to transparency, but the real argument I want to make is about audio-digital recorders. So, and this goes back to something I asked earlier. I asked it in connection with car stops, but I could have asked it in connection with anything. How many of you have ever been asked by the police for consent to search? Okay. And I'm curious, just three hands? I think if I knew you better, there'd be more hands, because people would be less shy. Did you say yes, the three of you? Did you want to say yes?
I mean, I had none to hide, so like you can search through my bag.
Okay. Did you want to say yes?
No.
I said yes.
But they asked in such a way that it was hard to say, you know?
So consent is actually this big thing. Like some scholars estimate that something like 90% of all searches are the product of consent. But also scholars sort of say consent is a fiction. So I think technology can also deal with the problem of consent. Consent is deeply problematic for a number of reasons. In my paper, I talk about 4 reasons. The Rashomon effect. I don't know if many of you have seen the movie Rashomon, but basically it goes back to perspectives. We all have different perspectives, and those perspectives sort of, are based on our self-interest. So, if we're both leaving, if several people are leaving a police-citizen encounter, the citizen is going to recall that event one way, the officer a different way. They might both be completely honest, but they recall it differently because of their perspectives. Psychological pressures. So sometimes you don't feel like you could say no. There's a great study. It was very small, but it was of 54 drivers who had been asked for consent to search. Of the 54 drivers, 49 gave consent. So that already suggests, like, okay, why 49 out of 54, they're giving consent? And when you dig deeper, of the 49 who gave consent, 47 when asked felt that they felt that they could not say no. So they did not, of the 47 of the 49 who gave consent, 47 did not believe their consent was truly voluntary. They just basically felt pressured into it. There's also the murkiness of language, so if an officer says, pop open your trunk, can you pop open your trunk? Does that mean please? Does that mean will you? Obviously, officers don't have to advise you that you have the right to refuse consent. And then there's test lines. So all these ways where simply an officer pulling out, again, his iPhone and pressing voice record can address a lot of these issues. So stop and frisk, as some of you know, probably we can trace back at least to the case Terry v. Ohio from 45 years ago, where the Supreme Court basically says if an officer has articulable reasonable suspicion that criminal activity is afoot, the officer can stop somebody, just a limited detention, stop somebody, ask them questions, and if they also have reasonable suspicion the person might be armed and dangerous, they could do a limited search, a pat down. This has exploded. So officers, it went from a case where literally officers were watching guys for like 5 minutes, casing a store. So it's exploded to everything. So now we have stop and frisk all over, and it's just mushroomed. And as all of you know, there's a racial component to this. So I'm sure as everybody in this room knows, with the Floyd decision in New York, out of the individuals stopped in New York, 84% were Black or Hispanic, far in excess of their representation of the population. And the same is true when you look at other cities. So Boston is 63%, Maryland, almost 73% of the people stopped on I-90 were Black or Hispanic. And in terms of accuracy, it's pretty unimpressive. So in New York, of the people stopped, only 1 in 20 ended up being arrested. And even that number probably overstates the accuracy of the stop or the legitimacy of the arrest, since about half of those arrests were eventually thrown out or dismissed. If the real goal is looking for guns, even worse. 1 in 1,000 people stopped and searched had guns. So there's also another problem with stop and frisk that we tend to not talk about, but it's also buried in that, and that's just how many people it affects. So New York, over the course of 8 years, 4.4 million people. So it's both who stopped and how many people stopped. But technology can address some of this. So quickly, Terahertz scanning devices. There are these new devices that are capable of scanning from a distance for firearms. The real goal of stop and frisk is to get firearms off the street. An officer can actually sit in a vehicle and just point a device at a street and figure out whether anybody is carrying a firearm. Facial recognition technology. Basically, we have technology, and this was demonstrated in a football stadium. It could actually scan the stadium in seconds and pinpoint the person they're looking for. It actually works in 2 ways. So you could pinpoint the person you're looking for, or you could use this device to sort of stop on, let's say, Thomas, and basically run the program and say, okay, who's Thomas? Add to that big data, add to this automated suspicion algorithms. All of this technology basically allows the police, if they took advantage of it, to hypothetically scan a room, say, oh, I want to know who that guy is sitting in the back with the hoodie, and know in a second, oh, his first name is Thomas, I would know your last name, I would know your age, I would know your credit card history, I would know your web browsing activity, I would know your criminal history, I would know all of that. This might seem scary, but imagine at the same time how it might improve accuracy when it comes to policing. Instead of the police stopping 4.4 million people, you know, the vast majority of whom are innocent and were doing nothing wrong, they would actually have technology that's much more precise, much more accurate, and would actually focus on really the people who are potential wrongdoers. It would also sort of reduce racial profiling, so there would be all these other benefits. So in the Q&A, I might talk a little bit about redistributing privacy, but I'm going to stop there. Evelyn, so it's a great question. You're actually asking the same question the Supreme Court asked itself just a few years ago in a case called Jones. And if we have, it's just sort of an interesting history. The history used to be anything you shared with any movement in public, you did not have a reasonable expectation of privacy, and therefore the Fourth Amendment did not apply. It's a reason why we could have surveillance cameras all across the city in public places, and it does not implicate the Fourth Amendment at all. So it was assumed that tracking somebody in public visually, not a Fourth Amendment search, and there were actually cases where things were attached to people's vehicles, or things were attached to things that were given to people. Like if I sold this woman an iPhone and I had a tracking device in it, and I used that to track her, that was not considered a Fourth Amendment search. The Supreme Court sort of, was presented with a slightly different issue in Jones. In Jones, what the police did was, instead of giving somebody something that secretly had a tracking device, what they did is they went to the person's vehicle and attached it. And that made all the difference. The court said, oh, because if somebody gives you something, you have no reasonable expectation that it will be tracking device free. But you do have a reasonable expectation that nobody will attach something to your vehicle. So in Jones, the Supreme Court sort of said, oh, what made that a search wasn't the fact that they were tracking the person. What really made it a search was the fact that they physically committed a trespass onto that person's vehicle by attaching something to it. So what's even more interesting, so just to add to that, because it was the attachment that made it a trespass and therefore made it a Fourth Amendment search, that means that now if the government is simply following you because your car already comes with the GPS device, that's still not a search within the meaning of the Fourth Amendment. How many of you have seen the movie?
What?
Rashomon? Yeah. So basically, and we see this replicated in lots of TV shows, but basically you put four people in a room, they all experience the same thing, and then you ask them to describe it afterwards, and they'll each give a description that might be sort of self-serving and self-interested, and each one is being completely honest. Each one is thinking, this is how I remember it, this is how it really happened. But in fact, it did not happen that way because nobody can be completely objective. So if you're dealing with the issue of an officer saying, oh, I asked Camille for consent. Camille. I asked Camille for consent. That might be how the officer honestly remembers it. Camille might honestly remember it is, he said, okay, open up your bag. Literally, we remember it differently. And it might be that the words I used as an officer are much more ambiguous, but what I remember about that word, what I said, instead of remember the actual words, I remember I asked her for consent. You saw the pressure in my asking, so you interpreted much more as a command. One other thing I could say, because I didn't talk about psychological pressures, is also a great study where they videotape an officer interviewing somebody and asking questions. And it's interesting when you show, they have a camera behind the officer, another camera behind the person being interviewed. When they show people the footage from the officer's perspective and ask them, oh, was there any pressure? Was this intimidating? They're like, no. When you show the same interaction, but from the perspective of the person being interviewed, they're like, oh, that seemed very intimidating. There's lots of pressure. So everything matters. And that's why I think technology can help resolve some of those problems. What's interesting about the case law is that the Supreme Court is basically, and I hate to generalize, but post the Warren Court, post the 60s, the Supreme Court has basically made things easier for the police. So in a case called Bustamante, they basically ruled the police do not have to advise somebody that they have the right to refuse consent. So obviously officers are going to take advantage of that, and they're never going to say, oh, by the way, you don't have to grant consent. They'll do the opposite and make it sound like you do have to grant consent. The other thing is, I think the way the whole system is set up sort of facilitates sort of that feeling that you have to. So one thing I talk about in my article, and somebody brought this up, you brought this up earlier. So when an officer pulls you over in a car, the first thing the officer does is probably says, can I see your license? Is the officer asking a question? No. He's ordering you, but he says, can I see your license? 2 minutes later, he might say, do you mind if I look in your trunk? If you're the person, you're thinking, okay, well, when he asks for my license, I know he has the right to look at my license. So I'm assuming he has the right to look in my trunk too. So maybe with technology, at least we have a record. We can make that whole transaction transparent. So a judge down the line could say, this wasn't done right. I'm going to throw this out. Yeah, so I think that's a great point. And all I'm going to do is add to it, because I think you're absolutely right. Everything is set up to make consent easy and the default. The only other thing I'm going to add, because this was actually relating to a paper that I was hoping to work on this summer and did not get to, which is, I think we also get the message from courts, from society, from everybody else, that part of being a good citizen is to cooperate and to give consent, which is sort of interesting. If you have the Fourth Amendment right to say no, it's sort of interesting that the message we get from the court is, oh, but what a good citizen is supposed to want to do is to say yes. One thing I tell my students, because the law is pretty clear on this is what the law says, but it sort of says this in theory. It's hard to apply this. What the law says is, if somebody, for example, refuses consent, the officer can turn around and use that refusal to sort of add to his or her articulable suspicion or probable cause. Basically, if you have the right to refuse consent, then that shouldn't change the equation. But we all know that's not really true. And it's so, one thing I occasionally like doing is on YouTube, you see these clips of people who secretly film their interactions with the police, and the police are like, trying to get consent to search the car, and the person knows their rights, and they're like, you don't have a warrant, you don't have probable cause, you're not searching my car, and the officers just get more irate and more irate. They bring dogs over, they pretend that the dog's alert to the presence of drugs, even though the dogs haven't really alert, and meanwhile the person has a secret sort of audio recorder or video recording the police. I tell my students, you all have the right to refuse consent. Good luck with that. I would never try it.
Okay.
Oh, Terahertz, T-E-R-A-H-E-R-T-Z scanners. So right now the technology is still sort of limited. I think they work from a distance of 40 feet or maybe 40 feet. But a lot of what I'm talking about is sort of aspirational. I mean, clearly if we invest the resources, we can improve the technology. And you could easily, what they've experimented with is literally having this device in vehicles keeping the device in a vehicle and just planting that vehicle like in Times Square. You would be able to tell whether anybody, whatever, on that block has a firearm that they shouldn't have. And that would sort of, instead of the police basically, as I put in my article, instead of the police sort of looking at the teenager and thinking, oh, what's that bulky thing in his pocket? Let me go frisk that person. That might be a gun. They would be able to tell with this device, it's not a gun. It's a cell phone or something. So it would reduce that kind of unwanted, unnecessary policing. The NYPD is already experimenting with these scanners. I know they have tried using them from vehicles. I think they've tried using them stationary. Clearly, we could develop technology to make them mobile if they're not. One concern, though, that I would have. So one thing I talk about in my article, I didn't talk about today, is clearly, I think we want technology that does not replicate the kind of racialized policing we already see. So we wouldn't want the kind of technology where NYPD has Terahertz scanners, and they're like, oh, let's go try this out in this highly minority community. We'd want the kind of technology where there is sort of a more type of democratic policing, where they have to use it. Yeah, and using it everywhere, or at least moving about where they use it. So it's like randomly picking city blocks rather than sort of saying, oh, let's go to Brownsville today. Yes, and one thing I should add, if you don't mind, I'm always interested in ideas about new technologies. So if you have ideas, even fantasies about like, okay, what kind of technologies would make policing better for you, please share them with me because they would be helpful to me. I would even give you credit in the article. So with driving under the influence, there are a couple of things. So the metabolism rate for alcohol dissipating from the blood is pretty quick, so officers want to be able to sometimes, if they can't use a breathalyzer, they want to get a blood sample pretty quickly in some states, like perhaps Florida. So they could always ask for consent again, and if the person's drunk enough, they might say yes. And under the Fourth Amendment, we don't care whether somebody's drunk when they consent. It's still valid consent. And the other thing is several states now, and this actually fits in with how quickly you can get warrants. There are lots of states now that have special, quick, 2-minute warrants you could get for dealing with blood alcohol levels. So there was a case, Missouri v. McNeely, a few years ago that went to the Supreme Court, where an officer drew blood because actually some prosecutor told him he could. And the Supreme Court said, in this day and age, when warrants are easy to obtain and where you're in a state where literally you could have gotten a special warrant to draw blood in a matter of minutes, we're going to say that the search you did, the blood you took, was unreasonable and it was a violation. So it depends on the state. If they have like one of these mechanisms in place.
Consent?
So either consent or some states have this sort of special warrant that you can get. Yeah. So I was actually having a conversation, so I'm on the Civilian Complaint Review Board. I was actually having a conversation with a fellow member about this, and so if the issue is whether the officer had probable cause to arrest James Blake, the answer is yes. The officer could have arrested James Blake, but that's not the issue that I think James Blake is dealing with. James Blake is like, yeah, you might have mistaken me for the guy. If it's 50-50, that's fine. That arrest was good. But the NYPD, like most police departments, requires the use of minimal force in making an arrest. So if I, for example, wanted to arrest you, and I had probable cause to believe that you had just, I don't know, what crime do you want to do? Let's say it's like, embezzled money from somebody. It would violate NYPD policy for me to tackle you to the ground. NYPD policy would require that I use minimal force first, and that would presumably be, excuse me, you're under arrest. turn around, put your arms behind your back. And then if you resist, then I could rough you up a little. But minimal force first. And I'm just going to add one thing because it fits in with the last part of my article that I didn't really get a chance to talk about, which is redistributing privacy. Because, and we just saw this with the recent study that NPR talked about a few days ago. You go across New York and every kid does not go to a school with metal detector. It's certain kids in certain neighborhoods. And when we see people in the media or in the public complain about privacy, like, I don't know if you guys remember Rand Paul getting searched at an airport and it was like national news. He was like, oh, you know, my rights are being violated. You know, or the don't touch my junk movement. The argument I make at the end is, you know, lots of people who complain about privacy are people who've always benefited from a lot of privacy. Meanwhile, people who have never enjoyed that privacy continue to suffer. Technology, I think, can sort of level the playing field. So what I'd want to see is scanning devices like that everywhere, so it's not just targeted at certain schools, and sort of minimizing it. So everybody would have to give up a little bit of privacy, but the trade-off would be more equal and better policing, more accurate policing, more transparent policing. So, you know, I think it's a conversation worth having. So I'm not sure if I'm suggesting parameters around the Fourth Amendment, but ultimately what I'm suggesting is let's have precisely that conversation. Like, let's have precisely the conversation about what are the trade-offs, what are the benefits, what are the advantages, the disadvantages. You know, clearly we live in a world with unequal policing, you know, where lots of people are targeted. And how do we feel about having what some people call soft surveillance, which is sort of like, you know, using technology, but you're never touched, you're never grabbed, you're never spun around, you're never publicly humiliated. What are the advantages of that versus sort of the more one-on-one, especially for people who might feel like, oh, I'd rather have somebody look at my bag. Is that true if you're the only person being singled out? Like, would you feel that way if the police came in this room, literally looked around, settled on you, and said, okay, turn around, and frisked you? So what's the trade-off? And how do we decide, like, what kind of society we want to live in? Which I guess is tied into the Fourth Amendment and sort of what we want to say is reasonable. So on that note, it looks like I am done. So thank you very much. You've been great.
Thank you so much.